Hello, everyone. This is Sarah Murray, one of the registered dietitians with the Villages Health. Today, we will be presenting on decoding the nutrition facts label. So we're going to be diving into this little label that we all see on the back of most of our foods that we pick up. So we're going to do an overview of the components of the nutrition facts label, talk about why the label is relevant, some label updates. So you might have noticed that the label was updated as of 2020. We're going to break down the label, so going into every component of the nutrition facts label, going into some health claims too, so that is those claims that you might see on the front of the label, kind of delve into what those actually mean, and then how to actually apply the label to your life, so what to actually take away from learning more about the nutrition facts label. The nutrition facts label tells us how much and of what. So it tells us about the food that we're looking at. The serving size is listed, calories per serving, the percent daily value per serving, and the nutrients per serving as well. The macro and micronutrients are included. Not everything is listed on there, but we'll dive more into that in just a moment here. This also includes the ingredients list. So the ingredients list is part of the nutrition facts label. So why is the label relevant? Why do we have this? Like I just said, it tells us how much and of what of the foods that we're looking at. And it has been required in some form since 1994. So it was developed originally in the 90s, and it was developed to help us make more healthy and more informed food choices. So we want to know what we're actually eating, and this tells us. And it's required on most prepared foods, except with no significant nutrition value. So coffees, spices, things like that, teas, you won't see it listed on those foods because there's no significant nutritional value. Whereas like coffee and tea, you might see caffeine listed. That's a requirement, but that's required to have a nutrition facts label. And there is a standard form. Like I said, they came up with the original form in the 1990s. And then they did just update it in 2020. So we'll go into that more in just a moment as well. So this is the standard nutrition facts label that you probably recognize. This is the standard format that they came out in 1994. And it does break down the serving size and servings per container. And then you'll see everything that we just mentioned briefly. And we'll go more into that in just a second. Here you can see the difference between the old label and the new label. So the new label for the FDA, companies had to release this by 2020 with a few exceptions, but in general, 2020, they have to roll out this new label. You can see some huge differences that are pretty obvious here. I think the calories is pretty much shouting at everyone right now. The calories is much bigger and bolder. Another bigger, bolder area is that serving size. So servings per container and serving size is the primary place you want to pay attention to, and they tried to make that a little bit more obvious for people too. So to give an example here, the serving size of this food is 2/3 of a cup. So that would be the volume measurement. And then they have the weighted measurement right beside that as 55 grams. So if you were to weigh out 2/3 of a cup of this food, it would weigh 55 grams on your scale. So that's just giving you another unit to look at if you don't have that measuring cup. If you have a scale, that's a great way to get some accurate idea of what a serving size of this food looks like. And then everything is broken down in the amount per serving below this. So for 8 servings per container, 1/8 of this food product, or 2/3 of a cup, or 55 grams of this food, you're looking at 230 calories. And you can see here that the calories from fat were actually removed on the new food label. So like I said, in the 90s is when the original food label was developed. And, you know, the big fad in the 90s was low fat everything. We really needed fat in the 90s. But we realized, you know, not all fat's bad. And we'll go into that more in just a second too. So you can see, you know, there's really no purpose for that calories from fat there. It really wasn't doing anything beneficial for our health. So they went ahead and removed that, and it made more room for us to put the calories a lot bigger and bolder. So you can see that that's really important too. Some other changes, just moving down on the list, the fat stayed the same, cholesterol, sodium, total carbohydrates still listed there. Dietary fiber is still listed, and then you can see sugars. So this is a little bit of a typo on this. It's supposed to say 12 sugars, 12 grams of sugar here on the left, as it does up here on the right, but that's just a little typo. But you can see in the new food label, you can see total sugars listed, and then includes however many grams from added sugar. That's a new line there. So we can see for this food, from the 12 grams of total sugar that's in the food, 10 grams of that is from added sugar. 10 grams of the sugar is dumped in by the manufacturer. There's only 2 grams of natural sugar in this food product. So this is really helpful to tell us the quality of the food that we're actually looking at. Protein stayed the same, and then a couple of the minerals and vitamins here on the bottom changed. They took off vitamin A and vitamin C, and they added vitamin D and potassium. So back when they came up with the food label in the 90s, most Americans were actually deficient, or at least many Americans were actually deficient in vitamin A and vitamin C. That's actually not the case anymore. That with so many of our foods are fortified, that's actually not relevant. So they removed those and they added something more relevant to us, vitamin A and potassium, and vitamin D and potassium. Those are minerals and vitamins that most Americans are actually deficient in now. So we really would like to focus on those, trying to make sure people are getting adequate amounts of vitamin D and potassium. Calcium and iron are still listed. Many people are still deficient in calcium and iron in a daily basis. So those are still listed there. Another difference that you might see is that confusing chart on the bottom left there is completely removed. No one really paid attention to that part, so they went ahead and removed it. It was really just taking up a lot of space that we can use for other things. So that's something we like to see gone. You might also notice some differences in the percent daily values that are listed there. Those percent daily values are still based on a 2,000 calorie per day diet, but they did change some of the recommended daily allowances for people. So we'll go into that more in just a second too, but just something to note there. And that's just an overview of the differences we have here. That larger, bolder serving size, larger and bolder calories, updated percent daily values. They added sugars to the foods. They changed some of the nutrients. And they also changed that footnote there. So as I said, the serving size is different here. We can see the difference here. The serving size is the primary place that we should look when we're looking at the food label. And to note, it is developed by the manufacturer. Some foods, there is a standard serving size, but it is just a serving size. It's not the portion that you necessarily would eat of that food. So you definitely want to pay attention to the serving size and servings per container initially, and think about how much of it you would actually eat. The serving size is not always realistic to what you would actually eat of that food. So pay attention to that part first and take into account, okay, I would actually make 2 servings out of this 8 serving per container box or whatever it might be. Just be really, really honest with yourself and think about how much of that food you would actually eat, because like I said, it's developed by the manufacturers, not by consumers. So think about how much of the food you would actually eat and take that into account, because everything below is based on that serving size that they list right here. They did change some serving sizes with the new food label as well. They did change some foods that many people would eat the whole thing of, or they would eat, fewer, or they would eat more servings of than is listed on the food label. They tried to make things a little bit more realistic, which is appreciated by many consumers. A lot of times a pint of ice cream, people will make 3 servings out of it. Some people make 1 serving out of it, but they're starting to change the serving sizes to be more relevant to how people actually eat their food. You may notice many foods that look like they may be a single serving bag, they would say there's actually 4 servings in there or 2 servings in there. So now they will mostly list for a serving that they recommend and for the whole container, which is really helpful. They're also doing this with many beverages. So instead of, if you buy a 16-ounce soda or something, instead of listing 2 servings for the container, they'll often list the nutrients for the whole bottle, because that's how many people would actually consume that. So it's allowing people to make more informed decisions in that way, and a little bit more relevant. Moving down on the food label, you have the calories listed here first, and this is that amount per serving. That's why that serving size is so important. But what is calories? Calories is simply the energy that you would receive from that food, how much energy that food would provide to you. So where is that energy coming from? It's coming from the fats, the carbohydrates, and the proteins from the foods. So calories are actually calculated from the fat, carbohydrates, and proteins that are in the food that you're looking at. If you're having anything with alcohol in it, alcohol also is a source of calories, but that's not often the case when we're eating food. Fat, for instance, has 9 calories per gram. Carbohydrates and protein both have 4 calories per gram. So you can actually calculate how many calories are in your food without looking at the calories up top if you have the carbohydrates, protein, content. And we'll go into that more a little bit later as well, which I like to call it the calorie game. I think it's fun. So the 2,000 calorie per day is the reference amount for everything that you'll see on the food label list. So just keep that in mind. There are many other things that to take in account when you're calculating how many calories someone needs. The typical person may or may not need 2,000 calories per day. A teenager boy who's very active versus an older petite woman, very different calorie needs. You definitely want to take into account other things like your age, your activity level, your height, your weight, your frame, and your health goals. Are you trying to gain weight or lose weight? What are you actually trying to do with your health? So this percent daily value is based on that 2,000 calorie per day recommendation. So it's, like I said, not accurate for everyone to go off of this 2,000 calorie per day percent daily value. This part can get really confusing for people, which is why I always encourage people to pay attention to the actual amounts listed in the food and know what their goals actually are. So this percent daily value, not the most accurate thing. It's just kind of to give a reference for, okay, this is how much a 2,000 calorie per day diet would be. Maybe that is what's recommended for you. Maybe you're shooting for more or for less, but just take that into account. This percent daily value can be confusing. Moving down on the food label list, right after your calories, you'll see fat listed. Fat is listed into total fat, and then you have saturated fat and trans fats listed from those fats. You also have cholesterol down there. So total fat, you have 8 grams of total fat in this food, for instance, and you have 1 gram of saturated fat, 0 grams from trans fats. But it doesn't quite add up to the total fat, does it? Rhetorical question. So you have 1 gram of saturated fat and 0 grams of trans fats. Where are the other 7 grams of fat coming from? The 7 grams of fat that are not listed on this food are going to be coming from unsaturated fats. So those are going to be our poly and mono unsaturated fats. They are not required to be listed on the food label. Some manufacturers will list it on the food labels, but it's not required. So many do not list it at all. So that's just something to keep in mind there. Our unsaturated fats are more heart healthy fats or more cardioprotective fats. So they are definitely not something that we necessarily want to avoid. So just keep in mind, it's kind of the warning fats that we have listed on here. We have the total fat, which can include the healthy fats. You have the saturated fats. So 1 gram of saturated fat, you may want to limit your saturated fat. The general recommendation is 20 grams, is less than 20 grams of saturated fat per day. But if you do have any kind of heart disease or are at risk of having heart disease, the recommendation is lower. Your daily recommended your daily recommended amount of fat did increase with this latest food label release, and that increased from 65 grams to 78 grams per day. So you will see that the percentage here increased as well. So it went from 12% of your recommended amount to 10% of your recommended amount. And that's because of the increase in the recommended amount for a typical American. The trans fats, you do want to avoid trans fats. So you would hope to see 0 there. And actually, as of 2020, they are not allowed to roll out any food that has trans fats in it. So largely these trans fats are going to be coming from foods in our diet that do not have the food label there, or maybe you're going to a restaurant and it's being created, and we can go more into that in just a minute as well. The cholesterol you'll see here, this is dietary cholesterol. Most dietary cholesterol actually gets absorbed in the colon before it actually hits our bloodstream. So if you're trying to lower your cholesterol levels in your blood, your LDL cholesterol specifically, going for that dietary cholesterol is not necessarily going to be so helpful. If you're eating an adequate amount of fiber in your diet, you more so want to limit the saturated fats in your diet if you're trying to manage your cholesterol. So those good fats, like I was mentioning, those unsaturated fats, those are going to be our mono and our polyunsaturated fats. Our polyunsaturated fats are where we get our omega-3 fatty acids, those really heart-healthy fats that we love. Those are going to be coming largely from our fatty fish, like our tuna and our salmon, sardines as well. Walnuts are actually the highest nut in omega-3 fatty acids, so very heart-healthy for us. Monounsaturated fats are also cardioprotective. Those are going to be things like our olive oil, our vegetable oils, our nut butters like peanut and almond butter, and avocados are also very high in monounsaturated fats. So these are our heart healthy fats, and we don't like to pick on those very much. Saturated fats, like I was saying, the ADA, the American Diabetes Association, and the American Heart Association recommend no more than 7% of your total calories per day coming from your saturated fats. So if you do have any kind of high blood pressure or are at risk of developing heart disease, you want to avoid eating more than 7% of your calories from saturated fats per day. So if you were on a 2,000 calorie per day diet, maybe shooting for less than 15 grams of saturated fat in any day. The saturated fats are largely coming from our dairy products, those whole milk dairy products, so cheese, milk, whole fat yogurt, and then those fatty meats, our animal meats like bacon, sausage, pepperonis. Some cold cuts, those are going to be the fattier cold cuts, but many like ribs or something, those are going to be high in fat, saturated fat specifically. Creams, butters, margarines, palm and palm oil and a lot of hydrogenated oils are going to be high in saturated fat. So I like to think about the tropical oils as being higher in saturated fats. Palm and coconut oil are high in saturated fats. And then if you do see hydrogenated oil on your food label, those are typically going to be big sources of saturated fats as well. Trans fatty acids, those are really coming from partially hydrogenated oil. So they're oils that have been heated and disfigured in some way. Oftentimes they're a lot more shelf stable, so they're stable at room temperature. So if you look at your ingredients list and you see partially hydrogenated oils, that food's going to contain trans fats, but it has been required to be taken out of circulation as of January 1st of this year. So it actually should not be in circulation anymore. We do want to avoid them. They're linked to a bunch of negative health effects in our body. It increases our body stores of fat. It increases insulin resistance, increases inflammation and LDL cholesterol. That's that lousy cholesterol. It's been linked to decreasing our good cholesterol, that HDL cholesterol. And it's often found in processed foods, those really shelf-stable foods like things like Twinkies that don't go bad forever, or things like a stick margarine. So stick margarine is stable at room temperature. It doesn't melt at all. And that's because of those trans fatty acids that are typically, they're very shelf stable. Tub margarine, on the other hand, is going to be more heart healthy. They don't make trans fatty acids in there because it doesn't need to be stable and in a stick form at room temperature. But many shortenings are going to be high in trans fatty acids, things like lard, things like that. Fast foods or anything that you might get that's fried at a restaurant is going to be high in trans fatty acids. Just thinking about how often they actually change that fry oil. Trans fatty acids can occur when oil is overheated or heated many times. So if you're buying fried food, if you're getting French fries from a restaurant, think about how often they might actually be changing that oil out. It could have been heated a number of times between the time that they originally poured it to the point that it's actually on your plate. So there could easily be trans fatty acids in that fried food. And these are just more reasons to avoid those trans fatty acids, especially. So like the body tends to store it way more often. It increases insulin resistance, which can affect your blood sugar control. It increases inflammation, which is going to damage all of the soft blood tissues of your body. And it does decrease your HDL cholesterol, that good cholesterol that we like to see higher in the blood. And it has been linked to raising your LDL cholesterol and your triglycerides. So we do not like to eat it very often. We want to avoid that if we can. Sodium is going to be the next thing you see on your food label. The recommended daily value for the typical American is 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. So this is just for a typical American without high blood pressure or any kind of heart disease. So many Americans actually need to be on a low sodium diet because of those comorbidities. So thinking about what might be recommended for you in your specific situation, a low sodium diet is considered 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day. So that percent daily value on the side there is not going to be applicable to you if you are to follow a low sodium diet. And just to give you a comparison, a typical American is eating about 3,600 milligrams of sodium a day. So we're way over the recommended amount, even if you don't have any kind of high blood pressure or heart disease. So just something to keep in mind there. And it is listed per serving, so 160 milligrams per serving of this food. And we do want to pay attention to this one because most of our sodium is coming from our processed and pre-prepared foods. It's not always coming from the salt shaker. But to give you an idea, 1 teaspoon of salt does have 2,300 milligrams of sodium. That's the whole amount of daily value for a typical American. So if a recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of salt, thinking about you're adding your whole day's worth of salt right there into the recipe, how much of that food are you actually going to eat? And sodium is just a mineral, and it is a major part of our table salt that we have. So sodium chloride is table salt. So sodium is a huge part of that, obviously. Like I said, most Americans are eating too much sodium in their diet, and that's largely coming from those processed and pre-prepared foods, not necessarily the salt shaker. But if you do need to reduce your sodium intake, getting rid of that salt shaker is going to be a step in the right direction. Trying to use other herbs and spices in your foods, even different methods of preparation can help to release those natural flavors from your foods. Crock pot or grilling can help to release some natural flavors without having to add too much more sodium, too much more salt to your food. So for a general American, we all need to eat less salt. So label reading, oftentimes you'll see foods advertised as low sodium or very low sodium or reduced sodium. What do those actually mean? Those are actually regulated terms that they put on the food labels. So if something's very low sodium, those are typically going to be something that's pretty natural in form. It's going to probably be a whole food, like a piece of vegetable, like asparagus or something like that. Very low sodium means it has 35 milligrams of sodium or less per serving. So that's a very low sodium food. A low sodium food has 140 milligrams or less per serving, just to give you perspective. That food label that we were just looking at had 160 milligrams of sodium per serving. So not quite low sodium, but pretty close. Reduced sodium is one you want to be wary about. You do want to look at the food label for this one to see how many milligrams of sodium is actually in that food, because reduced sodium simply means that the food is reduced by 25% of the sodium than the original food product. So the original can of soup, say, had 1,000 milligrams of sodium per serving, then reduced sodium variety still has 750 milligrams of sodium. So still a very high sodium food, but it is less than the original product, so they can advertise it as being that. And a quick tip that some people like to use: if salt's listed in the first 5 ingredients, it's probably too high in sodium. I like to just look at the actual amount of sodium that you have in the food. it gives you a better idea of exactly what you're looking at. When you're eating out, or if you are dining out at all, it can be helpful to try to see how you can modify that food product on your own. If you're going to a chain, they actually have to post the nutrition information online, so you can actually look up how much sodium is in the food that you are planning to eat before you actually go. Be really helpful. So if you just look up the chain that you're going to, nutrition, so say like Olive Garden nutrition, just put that into your search engine, and it will often come up with a PDF or some kind of interactive menu that you can click along and see how many milligrams of sodium is actually in your food product. You can also see the calories and carbohydrates, everything like that listed there as well. So a very helpful tool to use if you have the capabilities of doing that before you go out to eat. If you don't, then you can always see how you can make modifications on your own too. Asking for sauces or dressings on the side is always going to be an improvement. That's typically where a large amount of the salt is going to be lying for your foods. So if there's any kind of barbecue sauce on your food, maybe you can get that barbecue sauce on the side. If there's dressing with your salad, try to get that dressing on the side. That way you can actually moderate how much of that is actually going onto your food. Oftentimes restaurants will really cover that food in the dressing or the sauce. So it can help you to be more moderate in that way. Also thinking about some other things that might be on your food. If there's cheese or croutons or something that you can do without any kind of crunchy little things, those are typically going to be higher in sodium. If you can do without that, you can easily reduce the amount of sodium that you're actually eating there. It's not going to make it a low sodium food necessarily, but you can at least make an improvement. Carbohydrates are the next things listed on our foods here. Your total carbohydrates listed there. So carbohydrates are made up of sugar, starch, and fiber. So when they say total carbohydrates, that's including all three of those different components there. But again, this really isn't adding up here. So you have 37 grams total grams of total carbohydrates in this food, 7 grams from fiber, and 12 grams from sugar. So the other 21 grams of carbs in this food is going to be coming from starch. They do not have to list starch on the food label. They typically do not. So you just keep that in mind when you're looking at the total carbohydrates. It won't add up there, and that's because starch is not listed on the food label. The fiber that you see there, the dietary fiber, most Americans are not getting an adequate amount of fiber during the day. The standard daily value is 28 grams per day, and this does vary by country. Some countries are up to 40 grams of fiber per day as their recommendation. So we're on the lower end, and most Americans typically aren't even hitting that much. So we do want to try to increase the fiber where we can. We do want to increase it slowly, though. Increasing your fiber all at once can cause GI distress. So increasing your fiber slowly and then making sure you're drinking plenty of water with that as well, because it can cause constipation if you're not drinking adequate amounts of water and increasing your fiber intake. The sugar is listed there, as I mentioned earlier. They added the added sugar. So we can see that there's no recommendation for total sugar in the diet, but there is a recommendation for added sugar. And that doesn't mean that we want to necessarily hit all 100 grams or 100% of our added sugar for the day, but that's just to give you an idea. We don't want to go over that 100% of that recommended amount. So for an average American, the standard value is 50 grams. But if you look at somewhere like the American Heart Association, their recommendation is somewhere between 25 and 36 grams of added sugar per day. So a lot less than the standard daily value that they're listing here. However, the typical American consumes more than 82 grams of added sugar per day. So we are far exceeding even this higher end spectrum of recommended amount of sugar. So like I was saying, this can tell us about the quality of the food product that we're looking at. So it is very helpful to pay attention to that part right there. I do like this addition to the food label. So where are carbohydrates coming from? Our sugary foods like our fruit, Fructose is the primary carbohydrate there. It's a sugar. It's our fruit sugar. So this is coming from frozen fruit, fresh fruit, dried, or fruit juice. Milk also is a source of sugar in the form of lactose. So that's another carbohydrate there. Yogurt, just like milk, our lactose is going to be the primary sugar there unless they're flavoring it in some way. So trying to go for the more plain yogurts if you can. Greek yogurt's going to have some protein there as well. So it's going to have a little bit more protein than your standard yogurt. So a nice slower absorption of those carbohydrates than if you just did a regular yogurt. Starchy foods are going to be things like our pasta, our breads and our bagels, any kind of bread foods, pancakes, waffles, rice, starchy vegetables like potatoes, peas, corn, beans. Crackers are also going to be starchy foods as well, just to give you an idea of where our carbohydrates. So we do want to go for the more quality carbohydrates. So going for those whole fruits and whole vegetables if we can, going for whole grains when possible as well. So looking at your bread ingredients list and trying to make sure that the first ingredient there is going to be a whole grain. So whole is the word that we're looking for to start out the ingredients list. So it's important to look at that there. These foods are going to be higher in fiber. And they're going to have a slower rate of absorption, which is going to give us more sustained energy. It's going to help to keep us full longer. Oftentimes, these foods are actually higher in water content as well. So they're going to have more volume, help to keep us full. They're going to help to keep us more hydrated. These foods are going to be much more beneficial than empty carbohydrates here. These are going to be more sugary foods, more processed foods, cookies, ice cream, cake, candy, chips. These are going to be more processed and they're going to be lower in fiber. So when we want carbohydrates, we want to get the best quality carbohydrates that we can get. We want the higher fiber carbohydrates. So looking at your food label list and seeing the fiber content, comparing that with the foods that you're looking at, going for the high fiber when you can. But like I said, you don't want to increase that fiber overnight. If this is where you typically get your carbohydrates from, you don't want to just swap over to the other list without increasing your water intake and being prepared for any kind of GI distress, being acutely aware of any kind of GI distress that you might be feeling and taking that into account. So what is fiber? Fiber is the indigestible or hard to digest part of our plant foods. Some of it, most of it is passed through the intestines without being digested, but we do have gut bacteria that actually can help us to break down that fiber as well. So giving us more energy in that way. These foods are higher in a lot of micronutrients and vitamins like vitamin B and magnesium. So we love these fiber-rich foods that have more nutrients for us. So we want to aim for around 25 to 35 grams of fiber per day. And we can actually see these sometimes listed on the food label as an excellent source of fiber if they have 5 grams of fiber or more. And then a good source of fiber if they have 2.5 to 4.9 grams of fiber per serving. So going for those excellent and good sources of fiber, but you can always just flip the food around or go for those whole foods when you can. And like I said, fiber does contribute to our digestive health. It helps us to stay regular, helps to prevent any diarrhea or constipation. It can help us to feel full and satisfied after eating. So these are the way we want to go if possible. So the next thing on your food label that you'll see is protein. And you'll see that there's no percent daily value listed for protein. And that's because this does vary so much per person. Most Americans aren't getting enough protein, so it's really not too much of a concern. Most Americans want to get at least 50 grams of protein per day. Adult Americans want to get at least 50 grams of protein a day. Depending on their activity level, this might increase, it might decrease slightly, but in general, about 50 grams of protein per day is the minimum amount that you want to get. Where are our proteins coming from? Of course, they're coming largely from our animal products, and then from some vegetable sources as well. So they are really important to help us build muscle, repair muscle tissue. They're important for every cell in our body. And proteins do have a much slower absorption rate than our carbohydrates. So they're absorbed for about 4 to 6 hours from our stomach to our bloodstream versus carbohydrates being absorbed in about 1 to 2 hours. So if you're looking for something to keep you full for a while, try to have something balanced with a little bit of protein there. It'll help to slow down the absorption, give you a more steady blood sugar rise and fall, and energy as well. So very important there. A standard serving of protein is going to be a 3-ounce serving, which is about the size of a deck of cards. Some people like to compare that to their palm. So if you have a deck of cards, you can compare that to the size of your palm, since our palm sizes vary so much. So you can use that as a standard way as well. Like I said, our proteins are coming from a large amount of our animal products. So like our fish, our meat, poultry, and pork, our eggs. We do want to go for the lean cuts if we can. They're going to be lower in saturated fats. So remove the skin when you can, remove any of that visible fat that you may see. That'll make it a more lean cut. And egg yolks is going to be the majority. It's going to be all of the fat in the eggs that you're looking at there. So if you want a lean source of protein from your eggs, go for the egg whites or the egg substitutes. Cheese is going to be another source of protein, but again, it's going to be higher in saturated fats. So try to go for the reduced or the low-fat cheeses. To give you an idea, 1 ounce of cheese has 5 grams of saturated fat. So if you're going for a reduced saturated fat diet, that can be quite a bit of your saturated fat for the whole day if you're going for just 7% of your calories coming from saturated fat. Our nuts and seeds, beans, peas, lentils, legumes, they're all going to be good sources of plant proteins. They're also going to be lower in saturated fats than our animal proteins. So they're a great way to get some quality protein in without a lot of saturated fats. Nuts, nut butters, tofu, soy, those are all made from soybeans, so a nice bean source there. Trying to get a lot of proteins from there. It's going to be a great way to increase your fiber in as well. So you're getting plenty of fiber from those plant sources of protein. Moving down on the food label, like I mentioned, vitamin D and potassium are now on the food label list. And they took off vitamin A and vitamin C. And they also added the gram, the milligram or the microgram amounts of these. So the actual amounts listed there versus just the percent daily value, which is more helpful when you have specific goals that you're actually shooting for. Calcium and iron are still there, and they removed that confusing chart there on the bottom. So this is where we're going to play what I call the calorie game, to see how many calories we're actually getting from this food just based on what we see here, the fat, the carbohydrates, and the proteins in this food. So if you remember, that's where our calories are coming from, fat, carbs, and protein, and each of them have their own amount of calories per gram. So fat has 9 calories per gram, carbs and protein both have 4 calories per gram. So if we take a look at this food, we can see the fat grams in this food, there's 9 calories per gram. And in this food, we have 8 grams of total fat listed. So 72 calories from fat in this food. Moving down to our carbohydrates, we've got 37 grams of total carbs in this food. Our carbohydrates has 4 calories per gram. So 37 times 4, we have 148 calories from carbohydrates in this food. Protein listed here is 3 grams of protein. So 4 calories per gram of protein, 4 times 3, we have 12 calories from protein in this food. Adding that all up together, you have the actual calories of being 232 calories in this food versus what they're saying the calorie amount in this food is 230. So they're actually allowed to round these numbers, and they do pretty much always. It's very rare that you'll actually see 232 or 237 or an odd number listed there. So they do often round these numbers. So just something to keep in mind there. There are a little bit of hidden calories listed in your food that are not listed in your food rather. So something to keep in mind if you ate all of this food with 2 extra calories per serving, that's an extra 16 calories there. That can kind of add up throughout the day if they're rounding on a major scale or if you're eating a large amount of other servings of many different foods. It can really add up in little ways. So just something to keep in mind there. I like to play the calorie game every once in a while just to see how far off they can go. So as I mentioned, your ingredients list is also included here. It's an important part of that food label. And the ingredients, like I was saying, you always want to look for that whole in your foods. You're looking for the whole grain, the whole wheat. You can see in this food label here on the right, we have exactly that whole word written there. And it is in descending order by weight. So if whole wheat flour is the first ingredient on this food, that's what is contributing the most weight to this food. Water is the second most, and then corn syrup is the third most. Just to give you an idea of where your ingredients fall. But it doesn't say exactly how much of each is listed in the food. You just see the order. And like I said, you want the first ingredient to be a whole food. So typically the first 3 ingredients in the food label is going to give you an overall idea of what the food actually is. For this bread that we have here, whole wheat flour, water, and corn syrup, it's probably, obviously bread, it is bread, but you can see it probably is bread because of flour, water, and sugar, essentially. So to give you an idea there. In this food, we have pasteurized sweet cream and salt, probably butter, which it is. Some people say to look for clean labels, but I like to pay attention to the actual nutrition facts label because just because there's 2 ingredients in this food doesn't mean that it's an excellent food to go for. It's still higher in saturated fats. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your foods. It is helpful to go for the fewer ingredients, the better. Compared to this ingredients list, there's a lot of things on here that we probably can't even pronounce. So going for the fewer ingredients is always going to be better, but not always meaning it's a free for all. This is something else I like to pay attention to too with the ingredients list. There's so many things that they can say in terms of sugar. So if we look at this food list here, we have corn syrup listed, and we have honey there, so that's another source of sugar. There are so many different names for sugar in our foods. This is just really for the wow factor of how many different names for sugar there really are in our foods. And this is cutting it off somewhere too. This isn't literally all of the sources of sugar that you can have, but this is to give you an idea of how many different names for sugar can be listed. That's why I love that they added that includes however many grams from added sugar on the nutrition label. That way you can, instead of knowing every single word for sugar that there might be, you can just look at the added ingredient, added sugar, and see how many grams of added sugar is actually in your food. Much more explicit. I don't know how many of you guys have seen this facts up front here. It's listed on the front of your foods. And this is something that you'll often see on especially like cereals. I see it on a lot of cereals. And it's something that's not federally regulated. It's something that the manufacturers came up with on their own and they started rolling it out on their own. So it's the industry created version of the nutrition facts panel. You can see that there's only a few things listed here. 4 things are listed here versus if you turn the food around, you would get a lot more information of what you're actually looking at on the food. So I always bring a skeptical eye to this because it is kind of what the company wants to highlight from their food. It's not always going to be the best thing to look at. They're probably just highlighting things that they think people might want to know about their food. So if it's going to be a low sugar food, they're probably going to mark it up as being, they're probably going to put their sugar up front here, even though you might actually be just watching the total carbs that you're eating. So looking at the food label instead of being distracted by the facts up front here, I always bring a skeptical eye to this. Some other health claims that we may want to keep in mind and we might see on our food labels. So you'll probably see organic on your food labels. So organic is a regulated term. It's made that the food is made without most conventional pesticides, fertilizers, or without fertilizers that have any kind of synthetic ingredients, or is made without sewage sludge, bioengineering, ionized radiation. So it's out without any of those types of fertilizers. So it's avoiding conventional pesticides, only using these organic pesticides that are actually, there's a few that are actually allowed, and those are the only ones that are used. So organic actually is a health claim that is regulated, and oftentimes these foods are made in more nutrient dense soil. So typically these foods are going to have more nutrients to them, but that's pretty much the only difference here. There hasn't been any negative effects really to conventional. If that's what you can afford, then by all means buy the conventional fruits and vegetables. You don't have to buy just organic, but there are probably a little bit more nutrients in the organic varieties. Non-GMO is another claim that you might see. So non-GMO is a regulated health claim, and all organic food is non-GMO. Non-GMO is not inherently organic. So they are two different terms. They do mean two different things. And the non-GMO means that they're made with foods from non-GMO ingredients. And there are only certain things that are allowed to be GMO, or genetically modified organisms, in the food industry. So it can be made, the food's made without GMO or genetically modified corn, soybeans, canola, alfalfa. So they're foods without those ingredients that have been genetically modified in some way. And oftentimes they do genetically modify the foods just so that they can be more resistant to drought or certain pests, or other types of diseases. So they're not genetically modifying it for necessarily negative reasons. They're trying to increase the crop in that way. And I think the biggest health concern here has been what they're actually doing to the environment versus what actually is going on in the human body when we eat GMO foods. There hasn't been any negative health effects that have been linked to people eating GMO foods versus non-GMO foods. GMO free, this is an impossible claim to test. You can't grab a section of a food and test if there's GMOs in it. That's not a testing that is available. So GMO free is an impossible claim. If you see that, definitely, put the product down. It's probably something a little out there. No added hormones. This one can be misleading because all poultry must be raised without hormones. So if you see this on your poultry and it's marked up a whole bunch, keep in mind all poultry has to be raised without hormones. So that's something to just bring a skeptical eye to. Cage free. So this is, usually our eggs or our chicken. So chickens have to have 1 square foot of roaming space in cage-free foods to be labeled as cage-free. So 1 square foot, I don't know if you want to think about that, hold your hands up and try to see what a 1 square foot of roaming space actually looks like. It's not very big. So 1 square foot of roaming space for cage-free chickens, it's really, I don't know how much of quality of life that actually is. Free range, very similar conditions to 1 square foot of roaming space, except for they do have access to the outdoors. But it's not regulated how much they actually go outside. So this can be one small window that they have at the top of the coop, and it's not regulated how often they actually go outside. So this can be open for 2 hours of the day, and then they close it again, and that's considered free range. So not really, a regulated health claim. And then pasture raised. So this one's actually more legitimate. Pasture raised means that the animals actually have access to the pasture all year round. So they can actually go as they please. Grass fed. So the grass fed animals, in addition to they're fed the grass in addition to being able to roam the pastures as they please. So they're fed grass. They may be supplemented sometimes with grain, but the primary food intake is that grass because they can go throughout the pastures and eat the grass. So grass-fed animals are typically higher in omega-3 fatty acids because they're eating more grass, which is higher in omega-3 fatty acids than the soy or the corn or whatever feed that they might actually be eating. So these foods are going to be higher in omega-3 fatty acids, so healthier for us on the back end. So those are just a few health claims that I like to go through. You can always let me know if you have more questions. But, you know, all in all, portions is the name of the game. Portions, 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 we like to say. So people are notoriously awful at estimating how much a serving actually is. When they try to serve themselves a cup, we're pretty bad at doing that. So get out those measuring cups, actually measure your food out. If you have a food scale, that's a great way to go about it too. The weight of the serving is always listed on the food label there, so you can actually weigh out your food. And it's really important, especially if you're first getting started, and then check in with yourself every couple of weeks or so to make sure that your portions haven't accidentally gotten larger or smaller or, you know, away from whatever you're actually shooting for. So by all means, get out those measuring cups or food scales and try to get some accuracy there, because portions is the name of the game. And it can allow you to have more flexibility too. You might realize that you're eating less than you initially thought, or you might be eating more than you initially thought, and now you can actually be more accurate with your food choices. And there are some tools out there. This is one that I like. It's just using your hand as a reference, because you bring these with you everywhere you go, so they're great references to use. This is a little blurry, but 3 to 4 ounces of protein is typically going to be about the size of your palm. But like I said, these palm sizes vary for us. So maybe bring out a size of a deck of cards and compare that to your palm size. That'll be about 3 to 4 ounces. One thumbnail is about a teaspoon. So if you're looking for a teaspoon of butter, just going for one thumbnail. Your whole thumb is 1 to 2 tablespoons. So this would be about a serving for some peanut butter or some cheese. One thumb is going to be the serving there. Your fist is about the size of a cup. Of course, everyone's fist size varies, and these are all up for discretion. But you know, just as rules of thumb, a cup is about a fist. So if you're looking for a serving of casserole when you're at Thanksgiving dinner or something, 1 cup about the size of your fist is going to be a serving of that casserole. A half of a cup is going to be about the size of 1 cupped hand. So if you're looking for a half of a cup of, I don't know, potatoes or ice cream or something, you can kind of use your hand to visualize how much you could actually fit in there. And then 2 cupped hands is going to be about 1 ounce. So about a serving of chips or crackers or pretzels would be about 2 cupped hands. But this is, you know, just 2 naturally cupped hands, not necessarily piled high and balancing. So, you know, be honest with yourself there. We're all pretty good at lying to ourselves in some way or another. So just trying to be honest. There's also the My Plate. So My Plate, I'm going to show you here. This is the My Plate. It's just to give you a general idea. So in general, you can use this as your steps. So using a dinner plate, you can cut it down the middle and then cut another section into quarters. So you have 3 sections on your plate. You want to fill the largest section with non-starchy vegetables. So think your broccoli, carrots, cauliflower, green beans, a mixed salad full of, you know, lettuce and tomatoes, peppers, onions, mushrooms. So that would be the largest section. The smallest sections, one you would want to put your starchy foods or your grains, so like rice or potatoes, your winter squashes perhaps, or your pasta. That would make up a quarter of your plate. And then the other quarter of your plate would be your protein, so some kind of animal source perhaps, like fish or chicken or something, going for those lean proteins when you can. And then you would want to add a serving of fruit, or you could add dairy or both as your meal plan allows. So just go back here. So in lieu of dairy in this food, in this plate, we had fruit. Oftentimes we can get the same vitamins and minerals that we can from our dairy, we can get from our fruit. So having that side of fruit or dairy is a great way to get that in. And then we have water here on the side, so staying hydrated because of all this fiber that we're eating. And then, of course, you see this ruler here on the bottom. So this is for a standard 9-inch plate. Plates have gotten larger over the years, so I encourage everyone to try to pay attention to the size of their plates. If you put the same amount of food on a larger plate, it's going to look like a lot less food. So be honest with yourself about the size of your plate. Sometimes it can be helpful to eat off of a smaller plate if you're trying to lose weight. So, be aware of how big your plates actually are. And if you go out to eat, those plates are typically even larger, about 11 inches or so. So trying to just keep that in mind when you are going out to eat. This may be a very large plate, so it could just be this could be a lot of food on a large plate, and it doesn't look like much to me, or just being aware of what you're actually doing there. So plate sizes can make a big difference in our brains. And then a recap of nutrition. What you do want to do, read those food labels. Try to measure your food and beverages so you can be aware of how much you're actually eating. We do want to eat carbohydrates, but going more for those more quality carbohydrates over the empty carbohydrates when we can. Try to eat your protein. We're going for the lean protein, as that'll be less in saturated fat. Those healthy fats, those unsaturated fats are going to be more heart healthy, so we want to go for those ones. We want to watch our sodium content. As we saw, most Americans are eating too much sodium, so we do want to try to limit the sodium where we can. And then do have a plan. Know what your goals are, know what you're actually aiming for. That way you have some kind of ballpark idea of what you're trying to do. Try not to eyeball or guess your food, especially at first. Like I said, humans are notoriously bad at being able to estimate volumes. So do try to measure your food. Avoiding those empty carbohydrates if you can, going for those more quality carbohydrates where you can, and trying not to eat too much saturated fat or sodium. Try to limit those ones, and definitely don't get discouraged. No one's perfect. There's no one perfect eating plan. So just trying to do the best with what you can. And there's only so much you can control. So just focusing on what you can actually control. There are some helpful apps or websites that people like to use, especially when they're first getting started. A lot of them have like blogs that go along with it, so you can get a good idea of how you're what you're actually shooting for. Things like Calorie King, Lose It, My Fitness Pal, there are apps and there's websites. Calorie King also comes in a print version, so you can kind of carry around a pocket size of the application and a bunch of information in there. And all of these are free, and making sure you're getting enough water. There's so many different daily water tracker apps, so you can try to see how much water you might actually be eating in a day. We are shooting for about 64 ounces of water at a minimum per day. So preparing yourself to that goal. Okay, so that is all I have for you today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed investigating the food label with me. But by all means, let us know if you have any questions. Everyone stay safe.